Hello, and welcome back to another episode of You Are Not Your Diagnosis. Today's episode is going to be an exploration of the connection between traumatic experiences that we've had in our lives and illness. This is a very important topic, and yet it's one that isn't talked about a whole lot. And so I want to make sure to devote a whole episode to it. I referred to it a little bit when I talked about epigenetics and how our genes get turned on and off, the role of trauma in our health issues. But I really think it's such an important topic that I wanted to devote a whole episode to it. So let's just dive in and talk a little bit about trauma and how does it connect to the likelihood of developing illness. And I don't want to make a direct equation saying because you've had a traumatic experience in your past that you necessarily have to develop chronic illness. That doesn't have to be the case, but there is definitely a strong relationship between people who've had trauma and those who are living with chronic illness. And by teasing apart this connection and understanding it better and understanding what we can do about the relationship between these two things and what we can do to heal trauma, I think it's very powerful and will help you with some new insights and maybe realizations about some work that needs to happen for you if you're on the healing path with your illness. So let's kind of dive into the topic and let's talk about, first of all, what happens when we have traumatic experiences, like what happens in our bodies, what happens in our brains. And again, this isn't going to be a deep dive into science, but I want to give a little bit of an overview of what trauma does. So trauma is, for one thing, it works with the fight or flight response in our bodies and in our brains. So let's just talk a little bit about what that fight or flight response is, how it was designed to work and operate years ago, in our ancestral past, and what stress and trauma has kind of done with our fight or flight response in modern times, because I think there's an important understanding that needs to happen here if it's not something that you know. So in our early days as humans on the planet, we primarily were out there, living on the land. We were either hunting, we were gathering. There wasn't a lot of day-to-day stress. The main stressor for people was that there were potentially predators, animals that could come along and kill us or harm us. And so the main thing that our nervous system was designed to do was be aware, scanning, and telling us, are we at risk of being attacked or not? And that risk was there, but it wasn't constant. So it was kind of like a background, running level of scanning the environment to determine, is there something that could attack me and potentially kill me? And when we would have that experience of, say, a tiger coming out and finding us and wanting to attack us, we would run away. Our bodies would go into fight or flight response. And I'll talk a little more about the mechanism that happens when we go into that. But our bodies would respond and we would run away from the danger, hopefully, successfully, and then we would kind of just shake it off. Or if we couldn't run away, we would fight for our lives, and assuming we survived, again, we would kind of just shake it off. And literally, and you see this in animals many times when there's a big stressor, they actually kind of shake it off. And we would shake it off. We would, sit and we would take some breaths and we might move our bodies, and then we would come back into homeostasis. And our nervous system would quiet back down. We would go back into parasympathetic branch of the nervous system, so that kind of rest and digest. And again, there was still that background scanning for danger of, could another tiger come along? But we didn't live the rest of the day in a state where there was all the response of our body. So what happens though when we're in stress is, because of that nature of what stress was designed to do and how we were designed to run away from danger or be prepared to fight, certain things happen in our bodies. So you all know about probably the hormone cortisol, stress hormone. So that gets released in our bodies as part of fight or flight. Muscles get more blood sent to them, the big muscles that prepare us to fight and run away. Our heart rate will go up, our blood pressure will change so that we're prepared for that exertion of fighting or running. Things like our immune system get kind of pushed and shut down a bit by cortisol, or shut down completely if we're constantly living in that state, because in that immediate moment of running away from a tiger, it's not really important to think about, fighting off a cold or doing those tasks. So our bodies are prioritizing certain things. Our reproductive system also gets shut down, because that's not important if you're just in that moment of running away for your life. But what's supposed to happen then, and what happened in early days of stressors, is we would switch out of that and all of those functions would come back to normal. So our respiration rate would go down, our heart rate would go down, our blood pressure would re-regulate, our immune system would wake back up. We would start doing some of the digestion, because that's one of the things also that goes offline when we're in stress. And because if you're running for your life, it's not really important to digest your lunch in that moment. Your muscles, the blood goes away from those and things kind of rebalance. But the problem is, for most of us in modern society, is that we're constantly going into that state. Everything tends to trigger us into fight or flight response, or some people never even really get out of that. So there's kind of two things that can happen. It can look like you're just triggered like by every little thing, and you're stressed every 5 minutes, and you start to kind of come out of it, but you're constantly triggered. And that's not how we're really designed to operate. We're designed to have these stressors be more rare than every 5 minutes. Or some people just never really come out of that stress response, and they're constantly in that fight or flight response, and the nervous system never re-regulates into parasympathetic, rest and digest. And so if you're living in that state, either of those two really, things like your immune function never come back online very well, your digestion is going to be off, your blood pressure is going to be up, you're going to have a faster heart rate. So your body is prepared for this danger, and yet the nature of the danger that most of us face today is very different than being chased by a wild tiger. I don't see many wild tigers, and you probably don't either. Short of, going on a safari or something like that, most of us are not going to be in danger from wild animals and predators, right? Our stress is different. And I don't know about you, but I don't tend to shake off when I've been stressed. Like, there's actually a particular healing modality that teaches people this trauma release exercises that taps into that ability to shake off the danger and the biological mechanism of that. But for most of us, we get stressed. Somebody cuts us off in traffic, and we maybe yell at them, and we kind of release a bunch of cortisol, but we're still sitting in our cars most of the time, so we haven't done anything to release and metabolize that hormone of cortisol and all the other stress hormones out of our bodies. So we're just kind of sitting in this cocktail of cortisol all of the time. So one of the things that happens also when we have cortisol in our system, just an overabundance of it, because we're constantly stressed out, we're constantly getting triggered into it, or we never come out of the stress response, is we develop a lot of inflammation in our bodies. That's one of the things that high cortisol can really do. And a lot of the conditions that are chronic illness in modern society have a strong component of inflammation, which is something you may or may not be aware of. And so if you're constantly stressed out and producing more cortisol and making more inflammation, you're creating more havoc in the body and more potential for danger. So that's kind of just a general sense of stress in general, but trauma is kind of a specific way that stress occurs in our lives, or something that happens to us, and it's usually a lot bigger than just being cut off in traffic. It's whether we've been abused as a child, whether we've been in a major car accident, people who've gone to war and are veterans. There are many factors and many things that are traumatic experiences in our lives, and I would definitely put receiving a chronic illness diagnosis as a trauma, and I want to talk a little bit more about that later in this episode. But all of those things, basically, they condition the brain to think the world isn't safe, for one. So the amygdala, which is the fight or flight alarm bell in our brain that basically sets off that response of fight or flight is always kind of primed to easily trigger, especially with anything that reminds us of the trauma that we went through. So, for example, I'll use myself. I have a little bit of PTSD from a major car accident that happened about 9 years ago, where I was sideswiped in my car by a semi. And so I have certain triggers when I'm in the car, and I've done a lot of work around this, but the triggers are still there. Trauma is a little bit tricky to fully heal in certain cases. So I haven't fully processed that particular piece, and I'm very aware of it. So when I see a semi and I'm driving and I'm in the car and I'm near one, that's definitely a stress trigger for me. Because it was a side swipe, I'm very aware of people next to me, even if it's not a semi. And I can feel activation in my nervous system. I can feel that thought kind of fire in my brain, and my amygdala get activated and say, you're not safe, like there's danger, and it wants to overlay what happened. So that's one of the things really that happens with trauma, is we're primed to kind of scan the environment, scan the world for things that remind us of that particular experience and that trauma. And then we easily can go into fight or flight because of that. So trauma can create a tremendous dysregulation in our nervous system and a tendency to be in fight or flight, and therefore create more inflammation in the body. So I was actually having tea with a colleague yesterday, a new friend, and we were talking a little bit about trauma, and she mentioned this study that I had actually come across as I was preparing for this episode. And it was a study done in the mid-90s with the CDC and Kaiser, and they were looking at the connection between adverse child events, which basically means traumatic experiences, being abused, neglected, those sorts of things, adversely, things that were bad that it majorly affected you in your childhood, and the connection between that and health issues later in life. And there was a definite correlation between having multiple or even just one adverse childhood event and the likelihood of developing things like cancer, cardiovascular disease, liver disease, all of these things. And they really prime the body for those diseases. And to come back to kind of that idea that I talked about in the episode, your genes are not your destiny, of how our genes turn on and off. And if this topic really interests you and you haven't listened to that episode, go back and take a listen, because it's a deeper dive into this mechanism. But basically, what happens when we experience trauma is different genes get turned on and off. It's an adaptive mechanism. So if you've experienced a trauma, in order to survive, your body may make certain adaptations. It may change how certain genes are regulating. And that might especially be in terms of how your nervous system is responding and how fight or flight is happening for you. So you might be primed with certain things to activate much more quickly, or for cortisol constantly to be pumping, because you need to be ready for the danger that you experienced. Especially with repeated traumas, you're ready for that, and your body is primed for it. So when those markers and stuff get added and there's activation of different genes, that can also then cascade to other genes that make us more likely and predisposed for certain health problems. So there's really a strong correlation, and even, just a basic Western medicine study, that study in the mid-90s is kind of a foundational piece of Western medicine, acknowledging that there's a connection between trauma and health problems later in life. Of course, the problem really is that most doctors don't talk to their patients in the diagnostic process or in the treatment process when we've been given a chronic health diagnosis, of looking back, like, what is your history? Have you had traumatic experiences in your past? What's there for you? Most doctors, I've never had a doctor really ask me that. I don't know about you, but I don't think it's overly common. So even though Western medicine has kind of acknowledged that there's this connection, it's not something that's really explored in terms of doctors and diagnosing things, figuring out the root, because I think that's another point that I really want to come back to is there's a lack of focus in Western medicine of coming back to the root and the why. Like, why did you develop this issue in the first place? There's much more focus on, okay, this is the diagnosis. You have this particular health condition. You have this autoimmune disease. For my case, you have this blood disorder, but there's not really a whole lot of time or focus on, well, why did this happen to you in the first place? And for me, that is much more important, because if we can understand the why and where this came from, and we can heal that why and where this came from, that is where powerful shifts can begin to happen. So at the end of this episode, I want to talk a little bit more about ideas of ways to start to address trauma. But this is kind of pointing to why this is so important to understand this connection for yourself. And looking back, you might take a few moments and think about things that have happened to you in your life, in your past, that were traumatic. And think about what happened to before, like in the 6 months to a year, likely, before you got really sick, before you received a diagnosis of a chronic illness. What was happening at that time? Because many times it was around that time that something traumatic happened. And then that ends up showing up in terms of the illness, the disease, manifesting at a slightly later date. Sometimes it can be very close after, but sometimes there's a little bit of a lag. So get curious for yourself. That's just one important thing that you can start to do, is just get curious. Another area I really want to talk about in terms of trauma that I find really interesting, and it was kind of a light bulb moment for me when I learned this in working with one of my teachers and mentors, is that there's a strong correlation between birth trauma. So maybe mom having a very long, difficult labor, maybe you were in danger as the birth was happening, like maybe something went wrong, all of those kinds of things. There's a strong correlation between that and later developing chronic illness, especially in the family of autoimmune disease. So when I heard my teacher share that, it was very interesting to me. It was interesting for her to say that she notices that pretty much all of her clients who have autoimmune disease, when she looks back and asks them about their birth, all of them had birth trauma. And so I want to talk about why that is, because you might be going like I did. I was like, what's that all about? Why would there be a correlation? So the correlation really has to do with the fact that in the first 2 weeks of our life after we're born, our immune system is in the process of developing. So when we're very first born, our immune system is not fully developed, and it doesn't fully know how to differentiate between us and the world. So us and what's not us. And in that first 2 weeks, that's what the immune system is learning how to do. It's learning how to figure out, what is human tissue that's my body, and what is everything else that I might need to react and respond to. What are pathogenic bacteria, what are different threats that the immune system needs to respond to. But we don't come in initially with that built into our bodies. We have to develop that in the first 2 weeks. So if you think about kind of the foundational moment of being born and your immune system not being developed yet, and then having a traumatic experience, it's going to create distortions in that process of the immune system developing. And really, it can even be trauma that happened in the first 2 weeks of life. So birth trauma or very, very early childhood trauma, something happened to you when you were a few days old. That can also play a role, because your immune system is still developing and figuring out what is dangerous to it, what is the threat, what does it need to respond to. So if you've experienced trauma in that particular period of life, that early childhood period, your immune system is probably going to tip more into overreactivity. So in a nutshell, explanation of kind of the two branches of the immune system is that there are the warriors, the ones that go out and they fight off all the pathogens and they take care of, potentially tumor infected cells and things that we need to get rid of to keep us healthy. So those are the warriors. And then there are the peacekeepers, the ones that come in and say, calm down inflammation, turn things back down. Like, not everything is a threat, because sometimes the warriors can get a little bit overly aggressive and overly responsive. And the peacekeepers come in and say, whoa, hold on, let's slow things down a little bit. Not everything is dangerous. So if you have birth trauma or very early childhood trauma, that tips kind of the warriors into more aggressive state often. And it can sometimes make the peacekeepers not very good peacekeepers. Like, they might actually tend to lean more to helping the warriors and being aggressive, or they might just kind of be asleep on the job. So by healing early childhood trauma, you can also do a lot of work to help rebalance your immune system. And that's one of the things that I work with sometimes with clients. It will come up to clear some trauma from their birth or from very early childhood experiences, because those things are actually changing how the immune system is functioning. They're changing the consciousness of the immune system. Consciousness just meaning kind of how it sees the world. Is the world always dangerous and a threat? Or is it more able to specify, like, there are threats there, but overall the world is safe and I can be in a calm state? So I hope that was insightful for you. And you might think, if you're somebody with an autoimmune disease, did you have birth trauma or very, very early childhood trauma? And just get curious about that. So one other study too that I just wanted to share before I shift into talking a little bit about what do we do with this knowledge, because I think I don't want to just dump a bunch of information on you and say there's a connection, but then, what can you do about that? But another interesting study that I found, which was in a rheumatology journal, it talked about how Holocaust survivors were twice as likely to develop fibromyalgia. And in this study, they talked about kind of fibromyalgia being like a hyperactive, hyperreactive nervous system disorder. So you can think, if you went through the trauma of going through and surviving the Holocaust, which would be trauma with a huge capital T, and you didn't even know if you were going to survive on a daily basis, your nervous system is going to be extremely hyperactive. And then that is going to create issues that down the line could become something like fibromyalgia, which I thought that was interesting too, because I haven't necessarily heard fibro referred to as a hyperactive nervous system, but that makes sense to me in a lot of ways, that, when our nervous system is very hyperactive, again, we have a lot of inflammation. Things are not getting repaired properly, because when we never come out of fight or flight, we never do the daily repair cycles that need to happen to keep us healthy and to repair all the parts that get damaged in the daily cycle of our lives. So just a kind of a little interesting tidbit that I wanted to share, because I found that particular study very interesting. So we've talked now about the connection between trauma, what happens in our nervous system, what happens in our bodies and our brains when we've gone through trauma, and how that can lead to things like a lot of inflammation, how that can condition our bodies to see the world as unsafe and prime us for disease. But what can we do about that? Because, that, again, like I've mentioned, it's not something many doctors are going to talk to you about or ask you about or give you recommendations about. And yet it is so important. And I would definitely say, and it was interesting to have this conversation yesterday with a colleague. She was saying, she works a lot with different nutrition and functional nutrition, and she can get people to a certain place. But sometimes if they haven't resolved trauma, it's like there's a wall and she can't get past that. And the trauma and the emotional piece has to heal for more healing to happen. So it was very interesting to kind of compare our notes. So what can you do? So there's many different approaches out there that are very beneficial for trauma. The work that I do has several tools that are very powerful and effective ways to clear trauma from the body. It's not a long, drawn-out process of talking about it. It's actually a way of energetically releasing it from where it's stored in our bodies and in our brains. It's amazing to me how in just a few minutes someone can go from rating something an 8 or 9 on a scale of 1 to 10 of intensity to it decreasing to, a 2, a 3, a 4 very, very rapidly because we're releasing it from the body. So I would suggest finding an approach like that, finding something like body talk in the work that I do, or another very effective way to address trauma is something called EMDR. It's eye movement desensitization and reprogramming, I think is the R. So many therapists are trained to do this, and it's a way of actually helping to reprogram and rewire the brain from that moment of trauma. It was something I used after the car accident to help with PTSD, and it definitely did make a difference in my reactivity to certain things. So that's another way. There are many therapists who are trauma specialists, so finding somebody like that to work with you. Working on the subconscious level is also very powerful, so perhaps a hypnotherapist might be of benefit. But the key thing is really not to just say, well, I had trauma in my past and there's nothing I can do about it, but to actually find ways to help you address the trauma. Because if it's never been addressed, if you've never really processed it and you know it's there and you probably feel it on a daily basis if you've had a major trauma. I know, I do, particularly mine is car related. So whenever I'm in my car, especially on highways, that trauma, I can feel certain pieces of it activated. And it used to be so bad I couldn't even drive on the highway. I couldn't tolerate being near a semi. And I can only imagine what my nervous system was doing in those moments because of that trauma, like how activated I was really becoming because of that particular issue. So I want to encourage you to just know that there is this connection, and then to seek support, because trauma is going to be something that's challenging to just address and heal on your own. Yes, you can do visualizations. Yes, you can journal on it, but trauma is typically held in the body. It's held in different ways. The brain gets programmed. And so many times it requires someone coming in to help you and to clear it. But it's so, so worth it. I've seen clients, most of my clients, there's some aspect of trauma that we have to address in working through their chronic illness and working through their autoimmune disease. So whether that be, a very difficult childhood, neglectful or abusive parents, and different things like that, we have to address it. We have to clear it from the body, or as my colleague who kind of works more with nutrition and supplements and rebalancing kind of the biochemistry of the body, without that part, we hit a certain wall. We have to address trauma in order to really fully heal and to get the results and to get to the place that you really want. You can't neglect the fact that if you have any trauma in your life, you have to address it. And I want to say, even if you didn't have a traumatic childhood, even if you can't think of anything that was majorly traumatic, just by the nature of being given a diagnosis, like probably the one you have, you've experienced trauma. That itself is traumatic. I know for me, hearing the word leukemia, even though now I know that that was incorrect, but when I heard that moment, or heard that word, that moment was a moment of trauma, and the moments after that followed it. And I had to do a lot of work to clear the emotion around that, to clear the trauma around that. And I know that I would not be as healthy and as resilient as I am now had I not done that. That was a foundational piece of healing for me. So even if there's nothing you can think of that was majorly traumatic in your childhood, or your young adulthood, or right before the illness happened, because sometimes we can develop illness without trauma. I would still say do some work around clearing the trauma of being given a diagnosis and kind of the ripple effect of that, like what that means for your life, because that is the moment that your life changed, right? I mean, we're going to look back on that moment and think that's when everything changed. There's before diagnosis and then there's after, and that moment that news was given to you is on some level traumatic. Might be more traumatic to some than to others, but I still think it's trauma. So I highly encourage you to do some work around clearing the energy of that, clearing the trauma of that, so that you can move forward and heal. Even the trauma of our ancestors actually really affects us as well. And that's one of the things that I love about the work I do, is we can clear that as well. So if you had an ancestor who, my mind is now on the Holocaust because of that study, who survived the Holocaust or who died in the Holocaust, if you have, different ancestors who lived through war and famine and things, or were abused, that is going to, again, through the epigenetics, through how genes get expressed, affect you. And you can clear that too in different systems, like the work that I do with Body Talk. So trauma is such a huge component of what makes us get sick. And by clearing and healing and processing and addressing it, we're definitely taking a huge step towards our healing and a huge step towards that life that you really want beyond the diagnosis. So that's about it for today, but I hope that there were some key nuggets, some information, some wisdom here that might shed some light on something. Again, go back and just journal a little bit, look on your past and think about what might have been part of your past that could be considered a trauma. Again, we don't have to necessarily think of trauma as, I had parents that beat me and, I was sexually assaulted. Like, other things can be traumatic. Sudden death of someone important to you, that can be a trauma. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to mean that you had the worst childhood ever, but we all have traumas in our lives. I would hazard a guess that most people have not gone through life without some sort of trauma, some degree of it, even if we don't necessarily think of it that way. So take some time with that, reach out for help, either to me or to someone else who might be able to support you if you know that there's trauma there and you want to do some healing work around that, which I highly encourage. And be well. I hope this was insightful for you, and I'm excited to know if you do this work and something changes for you. I would love to just hear. You're welcome to email me, send me a message, and let me know what shifts for you, because this is powerful. It's powerful to say, I'm going to do this healing work. It may not be easy, but it's worth it, and it's very, very impactful, very powerful.